International news now.
Okay, so we're going to start today with some background on the conflict over the House Speaker. And this is a story about divisions within the Republican caucus in the House of Representatives. And it revolves around three major events that really catalyzed the disgruntlement of particularly one small part of that Republican majority against the Speaker, Kevin McCarthy. And those three events were first, the results of the 2022 midterm elections. Second, the debate over raising the debt ceiling that happened over the summer. And then third, the debate over spending that nearly resulted in a government shutdown that happened just in the last couple of weeks. And so we're going to take these in turn, right? And so let me start with the results of the 2022 midterm elections. The root of the problem for Kevin McCarthy or anybody who was going to be the Speaker of the House of Representatives from the Republican Party dates back to the aftermath of the 2022 elections when the Republican Party won a narrow majority in the House of Representatives. And so we're going to start by showing a short audio clip from the New York The Daily podcast on how the results of the 2022 election made life for the new speaker difficult from the start. And so let's go ahead and roll that clip now.
You have to go back to January, where Kevin McCarthy, with a very slim majority in the House, has to fight tooth and nail to even become speaker. And in doing so, he had to make a number of promises to the hard right that already do not trust Kevin McCarthy. And a lot of them had to do with spending. He had to promise to keep spending levels low. He had to promise to pass individual appropriations bills instead of doing one big bill at the end of the year. He had to promise to give them 72 hours to review any materials. And perhaps most importantly, he had to promise to allow any single member who didn't like what Kevin McCarthy was doing to raise a motion to vacate, to kick him out of the chair.
Right.
And so he makes all these promises, and for a while he's doing exactly what the hard right wants.
What's going on? All right. So let me say a few things. McDonald's here causing chaos because he spills on himself with his little can.
With the magic water.
I think I got it wiped off.
Punishment for not going all in for his team.
Wearing the jersey.
Because he's inconsistent and unreliable and untrustworthy, like
McCarthy.
Yeah. Anyway, let's get back to it. The 2022 midterm elections unexpectedly really produced a small Republican majority in the House. During the campaign for the 2022 elections for the Congress, many observers talked of a possible red wave. Remember the red wave, right? That was going to produce a much larger Republican majority in the House. They were for sure going to win the House. They were going to win by wide margins. It also predicted the strong possibility that the Senate might also come under Republican control. That didn't happen, and the Democrats still have a majority in the Senate. And so these predictions turned out to be wrong. And there was a lot of blame for the disappointing outcome within Republican circles. Nevertheless, the results here from that 2022 election created a razor-thin majority for Republicans in the House. And this meant that Republicans had to remain united if they were going to pass any legislation or get anything done. And almost completely united. You couldn't shed hardly any votes. And then these sorts of circumstances, this empowers individual legislators and small cliques of individual legislators who can become swing votes on key decisions and thus become very important. And the first thing to note here is that this is a generic problem, and it happens to both political parties. So this problem of the math, so to speak, isn't just a Republican issue. For example, the Democrats have complained, and some complained quite mightily, about the outside influence of West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin, who is more conservative than many of his Democratic colleagues. Manchin has managed to hold up and shape various Democratic initiatives in the Senate because the Democrats needed his vote due to the very slim majority that they had in the Senate, and they had to then fashion policy to some of his priorities, and a lot of Democrats complained about how much influence he had. So after the 2022 midterm elections, the slim Republican majority in this case empowered a small group of very conservative Republicans because they were the swing vote. They were sort of out, they had different priorities and different strategies than the much larger majority of the Republicans in the House of Representatives. And this group, the size of it is sort of open to debate. Some say it's 5, some say it's 8, some say it's as large as 15. But this group used their leverage to delay the election of Kevin McCarthy as Speaker of the House. And the process of electing that Speaker, which is usually uncontroversial and quick, took 15 painful votes to complete over a series of days that made it look from the very beginning that this was going to be a Congress fraught with chaos and drama and the like. So because this group held out and kept McCarthy from getting the speakership he so desired, they were able to extract concessions from him on a variety of policy issues, particularly a promise, and we'll talk more about this in detail later in this module, about government spending and holding the line on government spending and reducing government spending because it has, in their view, gotten out of control. But the most important concession, arguably, was a procedural change that allowed any single House member to initiate a vote to remove the Speaker. And this was designed as an instrument of accountability in the eyes of the Republican holdouts. They basically were saying to Kevin McCarthy, if you do not fulfill your promises to us, then we have a way to remove you relatively easily in this procedural vote. And so Kevin McCarthy had less insulation from the vagaries of the daily grind of keeping a coalition together than previous speakers did, because they went into the process not really trusting McCarthy and whether he would stay true to their particular priorities.
So it takes Republicans 15 votes before Kevin McCarthy is chosen to be Speaker, and he only wins the support of his party by making significant concessions to this small collection of far-right Republican House members. So as Rob notes, he starts his tenure by following the wishes of the swing coalition of these conservative Republican legislators. However,
he puts them on committee chairs and things like that. He does some things that he promises.
He says he's going to start to listen to him, but now the 8 that voted against him are saying that he wasn't really listening to him. So The House quickly then comes to a major policy decision that brings McCarthy into conflict with these same conservative Republicans in the House, and that issue is the debt ceiling. So before we get to the battle over the debt ceiling and how it contributed to a worsening of relations between McCarthy and this faction of his party, we need to explain why the issue of raising the debt ceiling is so important. So to do this, we're going to show 2 clips from the Ones and Tooze podcast on the debt ceiling. So let's go ahead and roll the first clip.
But broadly speaking, this is far from a crazy way to do things. In fact, this is exactly how economists would recommend that you do this. You decide that you want to spend on investments, on wars, on social expenditure, and then you separate from that the question of how you finance that. And there are 3 broad ways of doing it: through taxes, which can be appropriate or not, depending on where the economy's at; through debt, which there may be more or less demand for, depending on how much saving there is and how much people want to put in the piggy bank; or, in extremis, by printing cash, which is what states can do because they issue money. Where this came from, this debt ceiling, is kind of interesting because it's double-edged. It limits, on the one hand, how much debt the federal government can issue, But the whole point of doing it in 1917 was, in fact, to say, and up to this point, you can borrow as much as you like and you can use it for whatever you like. So Congress is going to step away from regulating the specific purpose of borrowing and say to the Wilson administration in the middle of World War I, if you're doing some complex deal with our allies in the war, if you are doing some complex war mobilization thing, you don't want to have to come to Congress and ask permission for every $100 million you spend. Here's the limit. This is how far you can go. If you need any more than that, come back and ask us. And that's essentially how the debt ceiling is intended to work. It was brought back into effect with real drama in World War II on an even larger scale. And what's happened since then is that people have begun to play political football with it. So rather than it being the licensing, enabling, general purpose arrangement that it was originally intended to be, it's now become one of the main levers through which Congress checks the executive branch. And I think it's pretty clear right now that's what's going on in the United States at this current moment.
So let me make a few quick points here. The debt ceiling starts during World War I as a way to provide the Wilson administration more flexibility in financing the war effort. Rather than always having to go to Congress for funds, Congress could set a rather high limit on the amount of money that the executive branch could borrow. Up to that limit, the executive branch could borrow money for whatever purpose they saw fit, and he uses the example of getting funds to the Allies so that then they can buy war material to continue their war effort in Europe. It was only later that raising the debt limit became a way for Congress to check the executive branch. Under divided government, when different parties controlled the presidency and at least one part of Congress, the opposition could refuse to raise the debt limit as a way to extract policy concessions from the president's party. And so think about this in real terms. What it allows opposition parties to do is essentially revisit budgetary and spending decisions after they were initially compromised and reached. So let's imagine that the United States, under Democratic leadership, President Obama, they pass a series of legislation when they have unified government in 2010. Then they lose. Now we're in a situation of divided government. The Republicans have the House or the Senate. And so then in 2012, they can say, well, to raise the debt ceiling, we want to go back and revisit budgetary decisions you made in 2009, and we want cuts in those programs. So what happens is the debt ceiling limit has provided a vehicle for opposition parties to revisit prior spending decisions back when they're in the majority.
And so this is a little different than the podcast explanation where it says, well, they can just decide how they want to pay for it. That's not how it's being used. It's being used to say, that was a mistake. We got to roll that back. We got to change it and the like. And so it's not quite, the
They're
same.
using the rule in a different way from which it was intended. Right. And to be fair, both parties
this isn't a one-party thing. And so.
Okay, so now let me talk a little bit about the consequences of not raising the debt ceiling to emphasize how significant this issue could have been had McCarthy not negotiated with the Biden administration and the Democrats to raise it back in the early part of the summer. So let's roll that second clip from the Ones and Tooze podcast to get a sense of the implications of not raising the debt ceiling. So go ahead and roll that clip.
The nightmare scenario is America defaults on some of its outstanding debt. And why that matters is there's a huge pile of it, like we say, about $21 trillion circulating. And if any bit of that defaults, the whole lot becomes unstable. And that really would shake the global financial system to its foundations. And we know that in 2011, when this problem first arose acutely, there were contingency plans made in between the Treasury and the Fed to buy out the slices of debt that were coming due to ensure that no one actually got defaulted on, or rather, if anyone did, it would be the Fed. You then have entitlements that you've got to pay, Social Security obligations. You've got the salaries of public servants who actually in 2013 suffered furlough and were paid for only a fraction of the October of 2013. So that's a whole group of people who are hit. And ultimately, you have bondholders who have coupons that entitle them to interest on debt or indeed repayment of the principal. And if that obligation is not met, then you're technically in default. The worst case scenario is that people stop believing in the full faith and credit of the United States government. And that has to be avoided at absolutely all cost.
So the prospect of not raising the debt ceiling has real and very significant negative consequences for the U.S. economy and the global economy. The nightmare scenario is that a standoff over raising the debt ceiling goes so long that the US government actually defaults. It fails to pay its obligations to those that are holding government debt. It goes into default. And then we're looking at utter chaos in debt markets and in bond markets. This would most likely spark a recession, if not a depression in the United States and globally, and then have further long-term negative consequences than if investors lose faith in the US government's creditworthiness. It would be harder and more expensive, which means that interest rates for the US government to borrow money increase significantly, which makes it much harder for the US to borrow money in the future. And then our problem of deficits now would compound and get even worse. This would undermine the status of the US dollar as the reserve currency in the global economy as well. And it's really important here to understand this reserve currency status is a function of the fact that central banks, pension funds, private banks, state-owned investment funds, private investors all around the world hold treasury bonds as a safe investment. Treasury bonds are viewed as the safest investment around the world. The global economy relies on stable prices of these US debt or treasury bonds as a benchmark currency. So governments around the world peg their currency to the value of dollars, and they trade dollars by trading these treasury bonds. But if the bonds collapse in value, this means that China, which is sitting on somewhere north of $1 trillion in US Treasury bonds, if the price of those bonds falls by, say, 10%, then their reserve currency holdings for their central bank collapses, loses a significant portion of their wealth. Then they might want to sell their remaining bonds, which then creates a cycle where everyone is trying to get out of bonds, and now all of a sudden we don't have a reserve currency by which to benchmark value in the global economy. So the broader point, you can think about the dollar as oxygen to the global economy. Everyone needs it to breathe economically, to engage in transactions. But they're only willing to do that if they have confidence that the value of the dollar will be upheld, and that confidence comes from a confidence in the hope that Congress and the president will pay the debts of the United States. But when congressional officials hold the debt ceiling as hostage, then it raises uncertainty over whether Congress will actually honor these long-term obligations, which then creates uncertainty about the value of the dollar and makes people less willing to hold it. Okay, so given all of these terrible potential outcomes, it's not surprising that Kevin McCarthy ultimately reached out to Democrats back in May and made a last-minute deal with Biden to raise the debt ceiling and avoid default.
Can I? What's surprising to me, because I'm always like shocked that they come so damn close to the deadline, is that it always happens so late. And in fact, you know, they even were a little earlier than previous challenges, right? Because in previous challenges, they go past the deadline to raise the debt ceiling, and then the Treasury does special measures to kind of keep the things going, and then they wait to when those special measures actually run out, and the whole thing's going to collapse and really go into default, and then they come to this last-minute deal. It has never been the case that they actually, you know, let the debt ceiling not get raised and you go into default because it's such a catastrophic potential.
Yes. When the holders of U.S. Treasury bonds, and what's a default look like? The holders of U.S. Treasury bonds don't get paid.
Yeah.
And if they don't get paid, then they start selling the bonds. And again, we're talking about
to get some percent than nothing, right? Because they're worried that it's going to just keep going down and down and down.
Exactly.
It's like a bank run. It's like, 50 cents on a dollar is better than zero.
Yeah, and to give you some sense, so the U.S. federal debt is about $31 trillion, I believe.
Give or take.
Give or take, and about 24 trillion of that is in marketable securities, which is these are tradable bonds, where the federal government borrows money for 30 days, 60 days, 2 years, 7 years, 10 years, 30 years. What happens if the U.S. Congress defaults, if the U.S. government defaults? Then the value of that $24 trillion that's held globally around the world, it falls right away. And the willingness of everyone else to continue to hold that debt collapses at the same time. And again, this is the oxygen for the global economy. Imagine, I mean, we all know what happens if we don't have oxygen.
Right.
We die. The metaphor works for the global economy as well. All right, so the argument from McCarthy's conservative Republican critics was not that he made a deal, but that the deal he made provided too many concessions to the other side, to the Democrats. They argued that McCarthy did not bargain hard enough for their goals and priorities.
And this point should be, addressed, right? Is that, everybody always starts pointing fingers when they get too close, and it's, the other side's fault. And it is the case that when you get into these kinds of negotiations, both sides should want to avoid a default at all costs. But then it always becomes, well, if that's the case, then just agree with us and we'll be fine, right? And so when the Biden administration says this should be without conditions, that we already agreed to spend the money, I don't think we need to negotiate at all. He's taken a position that he knows he'll eventually have to negotiate because the consequence is way too severe not to negotiate. And so it isn't how ridiculous it is for one side to try to use this leverage to get policy changes as much as it's a game of chicken, and sooner or later someone's got to flinch.
And I've got to draw a parallel, right? So you've been reading about the bargaining model of war. The last few modules, talked about it with you during office hours, and there's a parallel to what's going on here. Both sides have an incentive to avoid default,
right?
And that's the war outcome that is costly for everyone. At the same time, they both want to get a better deal, better distributional deal. For the Republicans, this means cutting spending, not raising taxes. For the Democrats, this means maintaining spending and raising taxes on the wealthiest individuals in the world to try and generate a long-term, sustainable fiscal situation. So they have disagreements over how to solve the deal, or how to come to a deal. So if one side says we need a deal no matter what, then that gives, as Rob said, that gives all the leverage to the other side. And as a result, then, they both run the risk of chaos by bringing us closer up to these deadlines every time. Both parties do this because they want to get a better deal.
They want a better deal. So now we're going to move on to the next crisis that really sealed the fate for Kevin McCarthy. So had McCarthy only struck a bargain with the Democrats to avoid a government default, right? Not, and the catastrophe that would have resulted in by agreeing and dealing with the Democrats and raising the debt ceiling. If he only did that, he might have survived as Speaker. There could have been a way where he could convince enough Republicans that just had to be done, right? The problem here, though, is that McCarthy quickly found himself facing another standoff that could have resulted in an unpleasant outcome, a government shutdown. And it was his actions related to the government shutdown that ultimately resulted in McCarthy's removal as Speaker. And you can, and we can debate later, was this inevitable and it was eventually going to happen no matter what happens. But there was this, burn me once, okay, I kind of learned my lessons, but you turn around and burn me twice, this is a pattern that can't be tolerated, right? And so now realize that I would argue that a government shutdown isn't quite the threat of catastrophe that a government default is, right? We've actually had government shutdowns, and they're painful. They sometimes last pretty long time, like 35, 40 days. But sides in these sorts of struggles oftentimes do go all the way and let the government shut down, right? We should talk a little bit about what actually happens. It's not some small little thing.
Yeah.
I mean,
it's tied to annual appropriations bills, where the federal government says, all right, we've got to give a budget to Health and Human Services, give to the Defense Department. They have to do this on an annual basis. Well, if they can't come to an agreement, then Congress isn't authorized, and the Treasury's not authorized to spend the money to give so Treasury can't release the funds to these different government agencies. So what happens? We get a shutdown. People can't work, and so so the government can't do its business, can't open up parks, and what that then means is people don't get paid. Government employees don't get paid for however long the shutdown goes. So we're talking about pulling, a couple million workers out of the American economy.
Including soldiers and border security agents and things like that. So it's not just like, so some people's vacations to national monuments are canceled. I mean, and these employees, they don't get paid for as long as the shutdown is, but then everybody knows that they do get back pay. It's not like they sacrifice the pay permanently. And a lot of people will say, look, they get paid, they just have to wait. But if anybody has ever had to wait, it's not that like, okay, well, then tell your mortgage company, well, I'm going to get paid, so you'll just have to wait too. And they don't, right? And so it is a big deal, particularly for those government workers who are subject to it. So we're going to talk a little bit about this latest threat of the government shutdown. So we're going to do another clip here from the Daily podcast on this controversy.
And then the second time is what we encountered this past weekend, where the country was on the brink of a government shutdown, and Kevin McCarthy was forced with a very important choice. Does he cut yet one more deal with Democrats, knowing he's already on very thin ice with those hard-right Republicans, to keep the government open, or does he go ahead and go into a government shutdown with all the problems that causes for the country, which is what some on the hard right want?
Right. And the presumption at the end of last week, as this shutdown loomed, and it was a presumption I think we established pretty firmly in our last episode, was that Speaker McCarthy would probably let the government shut down because he knew, as you've just said, that he has previously betrayed the trust of these far-right Republicans in the House. And to do it again would truly risk inviting them to try to remove him as speaker. And so this time, he would probably choose his job over a fiscal crisis.
Yeah, that was a widespread assumption that many of us reporters had on the Hill. We thought Kevin McCarthy was likely to allow the country to go into a government shutdown, that the far right had such a hold over him, he wouldn't defy them again. But we were wrong.
Madam Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass.
McCarthy, to many people's surprise, cuts a deal with Democrats. He puts a bill on the floor to keep the government open for the next month and a half.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 5860, a bill making continuing appropriations for fiscal year 2024 and for other purposes.
It does not have the deep cuts that Republicans wanted. It does please a lot of Democrats who vote, almost all of them, for this bill.
On this vote, the yeas are 335, the nays are 91.
And so many more Democrats end up voting for this bill to keep the government open than the Republicans do. And
the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
Kevin McCarthy makes this choice. He said it's the right thing to do. But for some of those hard-right Republicans, he's now broken their trust a second time.
Okay, so just to review, why does the government shut down, right? So every year, the Congress passes 12 spending bills by the end of September. That's a deadline, right? So I don't think they think that deadlines apply to them. It applies to all the rest of us, though. There's a deadline. End of September, you have to pass these 12 spending bills. That funds the government. And legally, the government can't keep going without those funds. And so that's why it shuts down. Now, Congress sometimes doesn't get it done. And so it passes then some short-term spending bills, sometimes called a continuing resolution. Sometimes they refer to it as an emergency spending bill that just buys them a little extra time. And so this happens a lot, right? And so they might have these disagreements and they need more time to talk it through. And so if they have to, the minimum they have to do is pass a short-term bill that just keeps the lights on, right? And usually the short-term bill is just an agreement agreement. We're going to keep spending as it is at the current rate of spending for some period of time. In this case, what the deal was that they said that we're going to continue funding the government for 45 days. And then we'll come back, and by mid-November, surely we'll have an overall agreement, pass all the 12. Sure, of course we're going to do that, and then it'll be fine, right? So that's the thing. Now, like the debt ceiling, this is an opportunity and has been used as a check when, under divided government, the party that does not hold the presidency wants to use the threat of a government shutdown to reconsider some policies. And so they would try to use their leverage and say, we're going to let the government shut down if we don't get some concessions. And so they want some negotiations. And so most commentators, and I agreed, I thought, this is going to be a shutdown because McCarthy can't go back again and deal with the Democrats ultimately and come to a negotiation to prevent a government shutdown. And of course, just like the debt ceiling, they always go to the very last second right before. And in this case, they waited until I think it was like 2 hours before midnight on the last day of September to pass this thing. But McCarthy, and a lot of people said, look, he loves the speakership too much. He's going to cave this time, and then we're going to go on a shutdown that's unnecessary, and who knows how it's going to end and how long it's going to last. But he didn't. He cut a deal again at the last hour, and that is how we avoided a government shutdown, which a lot of people agree was better than having a government shutdown and everything that goes with it. But it also just proved to the opposition that McCarthy will not really follow through on what they consider his promises to keep spending down and things like that. And you can say, well, he went to the well one more time. But in reality, what I'm sure the opposition says is he's going to do it again in 45 days. This is the pattern now. And so
he's got a commitment problem.
He's got a commitment problem. There you go. It's all about, theory. So,
all right. So that's some background on how McCarthy got into trouble with the most conservative wing of his party. So let's talk about his removal that's happened this week now. We're going to start a discussion with the clip from PBS Newshour on the vote to remove him. Let's run that clip.
Welcome to the NewsHour. For the first time in this nation's history, the House of Representatives has formally ousted its Speaker. A handful of hard-right Republicans and every Democrat voted together to remove the gavel from Speaker Kevin McCarthy's hand. Lawmakers from both parties spoke on the House floor ahead of the final vote.
Chaos is Speaker McCarthy. Chaos is somebody who we cannot trust with their word. The one thing that the White House, House Democrats, and many of us on the conservative side of the Republican caucus would argue is that the thing we have in common, Kevin McCarthy said something to all of us at one point or another that he didn't really mean and never intended to live up to. This body is entrenched in a suboptimal path and refuses to leave it. Refuses to leave that path. You cannot change if you're unwilling to change. We had every opportunity to change. We were promised change.
With the Democrats driving the fiscal bus off the cliff at 100 miles an hour, we cannot simply be content to be the party that slows it down to 95 just so we can sit in the front seat and wear the captain's hat. Our current debt and our spending trajectory is unsustainable. We need a speaker, ideally somebody who doesn't want to be speaker and hasn't pursued that at all costs for his entire adult life, who will meet the moment and do everything possible to fight for the country.
We're proud of the leadership he's shown. We're proud of the manner in which he's been willing to work with everybody in our conference and I believe in this chamber. There's a second group, small group. Honestly, they're willing to plunge this body into chaos and this country into uncertainty for reasons that only they really understand.
All right, so let me make a few points here. First, this is a historic vote. No party majority has voted to remove its own speaker ever. was tried one other time and the vote failed. So we are in uncharted territory here. Notice the speeches there. That's Republican infighting. That's not Republicans versus Democrats. That's all Republicans. Second, those who voted in favor of removing Kevin McCarthy as Speaker was a pretty strange coalition, a combination of 8 hard-right Republicans and 208 Democrats. Not one Democratic member of the House voted to save McCarthy. It needs to be emphasized that a large majority of Republicans voted to keep McCarthy as Speaker. So yes, the Republican Party removed its own Speaker, but the action was executed by 2 parts of the House. A small band of very conservative Republicans and the Democrats that disagree with each other on virtually everything, and this is important, don't trust each other at all. The only thing that they agreed on was that they wanted Kevin McCarthy gone. Lastly, it should be noted that this is a bad outcome for the House of Representatives. Business in the House is paused until a new Speaker is chosen. And given that it took 15 votes for the Republicans to choose their last Speaker back in January, this gridlock could take some time. But remember, the government's only funded for 45 days.
Right, so they got to get to it.
Yeah, so this means that this episode is a major risk for many actors. It's a risk for the House and the government in general if the selection of Speaker drags on too long. Right, we're back at this shutting down the government problem. But mostly, this is a risk for Republicans who have already undermined their brand with the voters, with this spectacle, and the risk of being perceived as incapable of governing, forming a stable majority coalition right before elections for president and Congress in 2024.
Okay. So now let's talk a bit more about the deeper factors that led to Kevin McCarthy's loss of the speakership. And we're going to start this discussion with another clip from PBS Newshour. And this one is an analysis of why Kevin McCarthy could not hold on to his position. So let's go ahead and roll that clip.
The list. First of all, as you heard in the tape from today, spending. That is driving a lot of these conservatives. They feel like Kevin McCarthy has not gone far enough to cut spending. But also underneath all of this, Jeff, is a clear distrust of Kevin McCarthy. His relationships, his lack of relationships is really hurting him right now. But in addition to that, there's some other factors. One of those, when you think about it, is the push for partisanship. Some of those who wanted him out think that Kevin McCarthy should not have tried to work with Democrats to keep government open. That's a factor in our government beyond Kevin McCarthy, and he's being punished for it right now. The last thing I'll say is President Trump, who himself did call for a government shutdown. He has been someone who has really injected into the Republican Party the idea that not only is disruption safe, but it is good. He has encouraged conservatives like this to try and challenge institutions, including the head of the institution of the House of Representatives itself. One other thing, Democrats, they had the option of saving Speaker McCarthy today, but also it comes down to relationships. They said that he has attacked them, lied about them. They came out of their meeting this morning, Jeff, very hot, saying, no way are we going to save him.
All right, let me just go through these factors a little bit and emphasize some and de-emphasize a few others, right? And so first, one thing that's not in this clip but was addressed earlier in various clips and by us is the math. This is a small majorities problem. It's just by its very nature harder to get anything done or remain a leader of a very small majority when that group has internal divisions and you need every single person or virtually every single person to vote in favor of something. And so this is a bit structural. It's not just about Kevin McCarthy. And then the next thing is the homogeneity, or actually the lack of homogeneity within the Republican Party right now. There is a split, and that split is based on policy, but it's also based on strategy. And as you saw in the clip with the speeches, there really is this division within, and a pretty hostile division within the Republican Party, in which there's a large group of Republicans who don't want to rock the boat, don't want to close and go all the way to a government shutdown, want to be able to govern in their eyes. And so they are angry not just at Democrats in terms of the polarization within the House and not getting anything any sort of compromise from them, but also with fellow Republicans, because they think that these hard-right Republicans are just unreasonable. And so those policy differences are not just the only thing, but there's strategic differences too.
Can I just ask them, can you switch to the tablet just so we can reinforce on the screen? Can you go to our tablet just so we can reinforce the math? All right, so here it is. In the House right now, the Republicans have 221 votes, the Democrats have 212. The Republicans need 218 votes to select or keep a speaker. This means that they need 218 of 221 Republicans to agree on anything, to get anything done, right? And this is nothing new here, right? This is how politics in the House works, particularly in the election of a speaker, but then oftentimes in policy as well. You rely on the votes from the majority party to get things done. And so McCarthy always had a very narrow path here to maintain power. He had to get most everyone to agree.
Right. And so, right.
We can go back to the other slide.
And so the margin for error is really small, and that, like we said, empowers these individuals. And if they are willing to stick to their guns, and they can remove the speaker, they can try to press their objectives. Right now, there also, though, is a political side to this, and that revolves around distrust of McCarthy. And this cuts two ways, right? And that small group that held up the vote for McCarthy in the first place for 15 votes was the same. They always distrusted the real conservative bona fides of Kevin McCarthy and his strategies as well. And so the repeated episodes of McCarthy ultimately dealing with the Democrats rather than satisfying that small group and getting their votes on board and going with only Republicans was develop this really healthy distrust and increase the healthy distrust of McCarthy, thinking that, even though he promised to provide all of these concessions and move toward us, he's not. When push comes to shove, he cuts us out and deals with the Democrats instead. And so that distrust, particularly within the Republican Party, was a major part of this. And there's some personal animosity between Matt Gaetz and Kevin McCarthy as well that fueled this, and so that's a big part of it. Now, the partisan conflict and this idea that was emphasized, this idea that there's parts of the Republican Party that just want to disrupt and really use these aggressive strategies, that's surely part of it. They are, there was this mention, well, this is, partly Donald Trump's, influence over the party. I would say, yeah, you can always factor that in, but the Republican Party has had this aspect of it, and arguably both parties use these sort of leverage points to try to get their concessions that they want from the other side. And this predates Trump. It's not like there's never been a government shutdown until Donald Trump got on the scene, and so I think it's more polarized than it's been before, and there's more willingness to use these sorts of strategies. But this is something that has been baked into the system for a while. One last thing to say about the specifics of the politics: the distrust of McCarthy ultimately did him in. Not only because of that distrust within the Republican Party, but also that distrust by the Democratic Party, because there was this consideration within the Democratic Party that perhaps it would be better for the Democrats to take some action to save McCarthy. And they wouldn't have even had to vote formally in favor of McCarthy. They could just be absent. They could vote present, which just means not yes or no, and lower the threshold for McCarthy, and he could have gotten over the hump. And there was some talk about moderate Democrats pushing for that. But then when the Democratic caucus met, the leader, Hakeem Jeffries, showed a video of Kevin McCarthy trashing their Democrats on a Sunday morning talk show that happened just a day or two before, and they said, no, we can't trust this guy either. You know, this guy is unreliable. He didn't offer any concessions to the Democrats to try to get their help, and so they didn't trust him either, and they let him sink.
And we should say, go and check this out. It was Face the Nation from last Sunday, which would have been October 1st. McCarthy basically went on and said it was the Democrats' fault that the continuing resolution to fund the government got passed. So he was the speaker. It was, and the Democrats were playing politics, and it was their fault that they passed.
Yeah.
And then the announcer said, "Wait a minute. They provided more votes for the bill than the Republican caucus did. You had 80 members of the Republican caucus that voted against it," and it was gaslighting, right?
Yeah.
He was trying to say it's the Democrats' fault that it passed, but he was the speaker and he brought it up, and it was his initiative. Anyway.
Yeah, and so
that infuriated the Democrats after they provided cover for him. So he could then say, I got to win, I kept the government open.
Right. And so I would say here that ultimately what McCarthy did, and he might have thought that he couldn't do anything else. He couldn't actually negotiate, with the Democrats and provide some concessions to get them to support him to stay on as speaker, because that would just politically infeasible. But he thought that the Democrats could very well save him just because he was the one who kept the government running, that he thought of himself in a role that I would say is a historical leadership mistake. And this is that there's leaders at times that find themselves in between polarized forces, and they think that they can survive politically by kind of tacking back and forth between the two polarized forces and becoming indispensable to both, right? And, my historical analogy would be Mikhail Gorbachev in the Soviet Union. Surprise, surprise. He was this moderate reformer, and he thought that the reformers needed him because he protected the reformers from the Communist Party. But then he also thought the Communist Party needed him because he protected the Communist Party from those reformers that were mobilizing in protests and strikes in the streets. And so he thought that both sides would keep him on pretty much indefinitely because he was the only figure that could just hold the whole thing together. But that, as it got more and more polarized, that middle ground became shrunk smaller and smaller, and ultimately both sides couldn't wait to get rid of him, and that was kind of the dynamic here. So
I don't need a World War I.
Yeah, you don't need.
I could provide one, but let's now shift to talking about how the politics of all this has implications for U.S. foreign policy. And the first issue we want to highlight is U.S. debt and interest payments on those debts. And this is not a current crisis for the economy right now, although it's starting to shape expectations about long-term interest rates, which are important. There's a potential problem that will begin in the near future due to a confluence of issues and the government's response to those issues. And to put it briefly, the Biden administration's attempts to control inflation by raising interest rates, and this isn't right. It's not Biden that's making these policies. Right. This is the Federal Reserve, who has a degree of independence from the Biden administration, is trying to control and limit inflation right now and drive it down to its 2% marker by raising interest rates. Well, these interest rate hikes are substantially raising the costs of paying for the interest on the national debt. And so let's walk through this argument and its implications. So the Federal Reserve started to raise interest rates sharply over the past year out of necessity. Inflation was reaching its highest level in decades, and something needed to be done to bring it down. The interest rate hikes arguably have worked, and inflation has begun to decline from we hit close to 10% down to about 3.5% to 4% now. However, the economy has remained strong, which is good, but unemployment rates have stayed low, which has created wage pressures that have continued to fuel inflation. Now, what that has meant in terms of interest rates is, and there's a shift in expectations, is we had interest rates that have gone up that have raised borrowing costs, and the hope was that they could be cut back down when the economy started to slow down. But the economy hasn't started to slow down, which means that interest rates now are expected to remain higher for longer than was originally expected, because we haven't hit that 2% target on inflation yet. And there's a threat that inflation can go back up.
They might raise rates further even. I mean,
Yes.
there was just a report today that said that, new hires were substantially...
August hires were about twice of what they were expecting.
And so that means that the Fed could raise rates again.
Yeah. So what does all this have to do with the national debt? Well, the U.S. ran large budget deficits under the Bush administration, under the Obama administration, under the Trump administration, and under the Biden administration. And these budget debts have added substantially to the national debt. So you think about budget deficit, it's like, what's the annual contribution to the national debt? That's a budget deficit. Right. And then the national debt is the sum total of all these deficits over the history of the United States. National debt, we're looking at about $31 trillion right now. Our deficit for the 2023 fiscal year was about $1.5 trillion. So one of the reasons that has increased the deficit is increased spending that was arguably necessary to respond to the COVID pandemic and achieve other policy goals, including expanding defense spending, which has gone up significantly in the last decade as well. So during the pandemic, the deficits and increasing debt were not that big of a deal because interest rates were zero. So the government could borrow in short-term markets for 0%. And it was free money, and Trump made this argument to justify the tax cuts that were passed in his administration. So the U.S. is essentially borrowing free money. That era is over. Short-term interest rates have gone from 0% in 2020 and 2021 that the government is paying for borrowing money for, say, 30 days or 60 days or 90 days. That's gone from 0 to 5.5% during this period of increasing of the hike by the Federal Reserve. Right, so now the cost of paying just the interest on those debts has increased substantially. The Congressional Budget Office, and just in the last year, I think that interest payments have gone up $300 billion for the U.S. government. And the U.S. government during this last year has only had to refinance about 30% of its net debt, not the total thing. But so what that means is this is an additional outlay of $300 billion that wasn't budgeted for, which then increases the budget deficit beyond what was anticipating. And the Congressional Budget Office has projected that interest costs are going to almost double over the upcoming decade, soaring from $745 billion in 2024 to $1.4 trillion in 2033. And to give you some sense of how important these numbers are, let's go to the tablet and give you briefly, could we go to the tablet, please? Yeah. Briefly, a picture of the nation's finances in the fiscal year 2023. The federal government took in $4 trillion. It spent $5.5 trillion. This means that there was a deficit of $1.5 trillion that necessitated borrowing an additional $1.5 trillion and adding $1.5 trillion more dollars to the national debt. Okay, where's all this spending going? Right? Why do we have these big deficits? The first thing to recognize is that a huge chunk of this spending Congress doesn't control. It's not discretionary spending, it's mandated. Sorry, that's already.
No, that's right.
And so about 3.45, Congress doesn't have any control over. It just has to spend it. Discretionary spending is about $2.05 trillion. And I should say in the discretionary or in the non-discretionary spending, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and interest on the debt.
You just have to pay that. That's non-discretionary.
Yeah, and the stuff that Congress is legislating in these appropriations bills is discretionary spending, about $2.05 trillion. Now remember though, the deficit is $1.5 trillion. And in that discretionary spending, about $736 billion is deficit. So the Republicans that shut down
is defense.
The House, 736 is defense spending.
Right.
The Republicans that shut down the House, that got rid of McCarthy, their response to this fiscal problem is we have to cut our way out of it. There's not going to be any new taxes. Look at what that means. If you're going to solve this problem solely through cuts, you have to cut discretionary spending by 75% across the board. That's Border Patrol, that's the Department of Justice, that's defense spending, That's unemployment insurance.
Education.
Yeah. It's not possible to cut by that much. The only answer here in the long run is to raise taxes, but neither party wants to consider that.
Or reform entitlements.
Yes, you're right. Cut taxes or reform entitlements.
Yeah.
But politically, that's really hard because who are the people who are most likely to vote? The ones that are on Social Security, right?
Right.
All right.
So that's the problem. So in a lot of ways, when you hear these things and you hear the parties debate, they're constantly trying to solve a really big problem, and they're right about the size of the problem.
Yeah.
And this is really, and now it's not this really large, far away problem or far off problem because interest rates are so low, let's worry about that later. Yeah. It's like a really large, immediate problem that's going to start happening soon. I mean, one of the things, and there's a comment on the slide that's like, just paying the nation's interests on the debt is going to become one of the more expensive programs, if you call it a program, right, of the U.S. government, in the sense that by 2029, like 5 years from now, a little over 5 years from now, that interest payment is going to be larger than all of our defense spending. You know, I mean, that's just insane to think about. The whole military, just paying the interest on the debt will be more than that. You go further out, and you know, these years seem like a long time. 2046 is going to be larger than Medicare. 2051 is going to be larger than Social Security. But if you don't start acting now, that's 30 years. You know, you got to start doing at least something about it now to even get a handle on it 3 decades from now. And, you know, that you can't have interest payments that are larger than Social Security payments and have both of those. Yeah, I mean, you just have to do something or raise taxes.
Yeah, I mean, another
or
way
some combination.
To think about the complication here right now is just this growth in interest payments. Over the last 18 months, interest payments are now responsible. If you just look at government revenues, which is one way to think about government revenues is what the public will tolerate with respect to taxation rates. The proportion of interest payments making up those revenues has essentially doubled in the last 18 months. They're now close to 20% of revenues. What happens when those interest payments double again? And we've only been through one cycle of monetary tightening to deal with inflation. What happens in the next cycle of because we know that this happens periodically. We go through cycles of monetary tightening. We've got another one 5 or 6 years from now. We've got another one after that. What happens to the national debt at that point? And so it's important to recognize the macroeconomic argument that's being made by these very conservative Republicans, we think is correct.
Right.
This is
deficit hawks are right.
Yes, this is going to be a catastrophic financial problem, and it's not 20 years away, it's probably 8 or 9 years away. And it will require drastic solutions, either cutting entitlement spending or significant tax increases.
Yeah. The last part of the Republican Party that talked about entitlement reform was Paul Ryan and the real fiscal deficit hawks. In that party is gone. Yeah. Right? And so there isn't really a constituency on that.
So can we bring this back to 2 foreign policy issues? And can we talk about just kind of U.S. grand strategy first and then come back to Ukraine? Sure. So let's think about this in the context of U.S. grand strategy and U.S. economic influence hegemony in the world. So what happens if all of a sudden we have drastic cuts in the U.S. budget that are required by this long-term debt problem? Well, let's think about this in the context of a 75% across-the-board cut in discretionary spending. What happens to the nation's military when that happens, right? So you're talking about reducing defense spending from $730 or $40 billion right now to levels of like $250 billion. That looks like spending in the 1980s. Right? And so you're talking about a massive retrenchment of U.S. interests and influence from around the world. Troops thousands, tens of thousands of troops stationed all around the world. The U.S. can't respond to any of those situations, pulls troops back. Allies get concerned about, wait a minute, you've been yelling at us to spend more on national defense, and now you're cutting defense spending back 60 or 70%. You have to talk about, can you maintain commitments within NATO under these conditions? Can you maintain deterrent conditions? Then you talk about foreign aid. U.S. foreign aid, a small part of the U.S. budget, tiny part. We're talking about $150 billion. It's exploded under Ukraine, but very small portion of this. But that contributes to stability operations, and or foreign aid helps to create more political stability on the ground to U.S. allies around the world. You pull all that money back, now all of a sudden you've got local fiscal crises in developing countries that dramatically undermine U.S. influence. A retrenchment of the U.S. budget, of the likes that we have to have without raising taxes, creates a huge retrenchment of U.S. global influence as a result.
Right. And so, most of those who are currently talking about huge budget cuts exclude defense. Yeah. And then that makes then even more impossible to actually get any real remedy for the kind of deficit and debt problem we have.
Yeah, and can I reinforce, right? So if you keep entitlement spending and you don't touch defense spending and you cut everything else in discretionary spending, you still have a deficit. You can't do it.
You can't do it. Right. And so
Ukraine.
So finally, we want to talk about the security element, and then we're going to just concentrate on Ukraine. And so one of the casualties, right, of the recent deal to avert the government shutdown was military aid for Ukraine. The deal that was struck by Kevin McCarthy and crafted by McCarthy pretty much was the same as the Senate version to get us a temporary relief from a government shutdown, except for one crucial thing. And that crucial thing was military aid for Ukraine. That was excluded. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what the ramification of that is. And I do want to show this last clip here because it shows President Biden's reaction, or a series of reactions to this part of the budget deal that avoided the government shutdown. So let's go ahead and roll that clip now.
Although the Speaker and an overwhelming majority of the Congress have steadfastly supported Ukraine to defend itself against the aggression and brutality of the Russians' attack on women and children, in addition to the military in Ukraine, there's no Ukraine funding in this agreement. Despite that, I did not believe we could let millions of Americans go through the pain of a government shutdown. But let's be clear. I hope my friends on the other side keep their word about support for Ukraine. They said they were going to support Ukraine in a separate vote. We cannot, under any circumstance, allow American support for Ukraine to be interrupted. I fully expect the Speaker to keep his commitment to secure the passage and support needed to help Ukraine as they defend themselves against aggression and brutality. Well, now this fall, the MAGA extremists once again have brought us to the brink, this time to a government shutdown, and going back on the deal they made months ago, not keeping their word. Enough is enough is enough. This is not that complicated. The brinkmanship has to end.
Speaker McCarthy's speakership is now at risk. Should Democrats vote to help him keep that job?
I don't have a vote on that matter. I'll leave that to the leadership of the House and the Senate.
Mr. President, what are your words to U.S. allies, and in particular Zelensky, on continued funding for Ukraine? How can you reassure them?
I can reassure them, look at me. We're going to get it done. I can't believe those who have voted for supporting Ukraine, overwhelming majority in the House and Senate, Democrat and Republican, will, for pure political reasons, let more people die needlessly in Ukraine.
All right, so let me just make a few points and then we'll wrap this up. So first, I think at least that this is a bigger problem than just the funding for the Ukraine military effort itself. This is a signal, it's a choice that was made to exclude Ukrainian funding as opposed to anything else from that deal. And it shows a signal to the rest of the world that the United States maybe losing some of its commitment to Ukraine. And it undermines Zelensky. Zelensky was just in the United States trying to get more aid and continue the aid. And this will send a signal that will hurt his standing within Ukraine and his ability to marshal support. It's going to send a signal to the broader Western alliance that is also struggling to maintain this aid. And so there's going to be some reservations there that if the United States isn't going to continue this, the whole thing's going to fall apart. So maybe we should bail now as well. And finally, it's going to send a signal to Vladimir Putin in Russia that their strategy, which has long been very apparent, at least to me and many others, that they can just wait out the West and they'll eventually, tire of supporting Ukraine, might be viable, that they might be able to just outlast the West. And so it's going to embolden them, not undermine their fighting spirit, so to speak. Within Congress, to me, it's unclear whether enough Republicans in the House will be able to at least publicly take the position of supporting military aid for Ukraine. It's becoming this sort of litmus test now for if you're really truly conservative, you're going to be against aid to Ukraine. And so moderate Republicans who've supported Ukraine in the past may be less willing, especially as the election gets closer and closer, to publicly express and fight for and try to convince their colleagues to adopt the position that we need to continue military aid. And finally, and the reason I showed this speech is that speech was a pep talk, sure, like, look at me, we'll get this done, and it's necessary, but it's not a plan. There's no plan there of how he would get it done and how he could convince the Republican Party, and there's certain Democrats that are opposed to this as well, to continue to support Ukraine. Because to me, the idea that I just can't believe that they would actually let more people die and continue, withhold aid in an existential fight for Ukraine, but also for democracy and to protect against Russian aggression to other European states. That's not a plan. That's just another expression of your position. And so something has to be more concrete to get this to happen. So,
all right.
I think that's it.
With that, we will see you next time. It'll be, I think, after the midterm. Otherwise, let's go Twins.
And let's go Longhorns this Saturday.
Yeah,
big game.
Big game. All right. Have a good one.